With the brilliance of your wisdom, O compassionate one, illuminate the darkness enclosing my mind. Enlighten my intelligence and wisdom so that I may gain insight into the Buddha's words and the texts that explain them. So, just to recap, we are in the chapter on the application of the Bodhisattva vow. And there's two parts. One is the section that explains the attitude that we generate. We call this the bodhicitta of aspiration, and then the way that we integrate this practically through the way our actions. And that's what we call the bodhicitta of application. And that's where particularly here we actually approach this in terms of what we call the 6 paramitas. You could say behavior or action that takes us beyond the ordinary confused way that we are stuck in delusion. Essentially the way that we solidify our experience of self and other, duality. And that's where the 6 paramitas, for example, generosity, giving, takes us out of this place of holding on to self. Discipline, patience, endeavor, and concentration further help this. And finally, we're looking at probably the most important one, or not probably, but certainly the most important one, but also the most subtle one, which is wisdom. It's because wisdom is what penetrates the delusion itself, right at the basis. So everything that we do in the Buddhist teaching is really aimed at this. But wisdom is not just sort of a philosophical project of knowing something, but it's about setting something free, namely Buddha nature. We all have intrinsically, and you could say a innate quality of non-delusion. And this is what the Buddha awakened to, and this is what all the Buddhas, bodhisattvas, and awakened persons throughout time have awakened to. And this is the freedom from fundamental delusion. So that's where wisdom is really important, because that's what enables us to discern where is the delusion, how is it that we misunderstand reality, and how can we be free from it. But in the context of doing that, we actually look at what is really the nature of reality. So that is it's not a philosophical project in the sense of just that we have some cerebral idea, but it's intended to be something that informs us so that we integrate this insight. It becomes part of us. If, for example, we can know that it's not particularly helpful to be angry, and we can have that intellect. We can talk about the problem with anger, or the problem with jealousy, or the problem with this, that, and the other. And you can say our neurotic patterns. But if we just talk about it, or if we just have it as a philosophy, it doesn't help. There has to be the integration. We have to actually walk the talk. Not because we're morally obliged to anybody, but simply if we want to achieve awakening. And this is what we're doing on the Mahayana path, particularly because we're motivated to do this for the benefit of others. Then it's really important that we actually follow through. And that is where the project of wisdom is not just about philosophy, but it's really about us understanding something that we need to then digest, integrate, and we then integrate it through the practice of meditation. So what is happening here, and let me just show you if I can get today there seems to be some issues with my display here. Anyway, if we look at the overview of this chapter here, and somebody was just asking, where are we in the text? So basically, we are presently down here towards the 4 tenet systems. But this comes within the context of understanding wisdom in terms of 3 elements, which is hearing the teachings, reflecting on them, and with reflecting we mean how we integrate this on a personal level, and then how we understand how this relates to ourselves, And then meditation is when we then integrate this practically. So you could say the wisdom that the Buddha is teaching is really to understand what is it that gets us caught up in confusion, what is it that sets us free. And when we understand how to identify our own confusion and how to identify what sets us free, then we integrate this through the practice of meditation. So that's where these three elements, we call them the three wisdoms or the three prajnas, really constitute what gets to the bottom of suffering altogether. And that's what runs as a red thread through all the practice that we have, whether we are practicing the general Buddhist teaching or we're practicing the Mahayana teachings, whether we're practicing Ngondro, if we're practicing sadhana, all of these aspects of the path are all intended for one sole purpose, and that is that of wisdom, to enable us to integrate insight into that sets us free from confusion. So we have here in the chapter then, we have first a section that explains a little bit about how to understand the Dharma. Here it is, what is the Dharma all about, particularly the two truths. And then we're going to be looking at the wisdom that comes from when we further integrate this in our own understanding. So we're studying this with the wonderful help of Kangyur Rinpoche's commentary, and we're drawing what Kangyur Rinpoche's commentary then draws on Omniscient Jigme Lingpa's root text. Okay, here's Omniscient Jigme Lingpa. So in the root verse, it says here, the subject and object appearing as two separate things, perceiver and perceived, is the all-concealing truth. By contrast, non-dual mind is absolute. This is the tenet of the Chittamatra school. Okay, now let's just backtrack slightly to understand what it is that we mean with the Chittamatra school and put it in perspective. And particularly when we here talk about the tenet systems, we last time were talking about the Vibhashika and the Sautrantika school. Now, what is the theme that runs through all of this is understanding the two truths. Now, the two truths are essentially understanding that things do appear in a particular way, as they do for each and every one of us. But also if we analyze, if we really look at the nature of things, if we look at things validly, as we would as scientists, as people who analyze or want to know what really is there and who want to know the truth, then we arrive at what we call ultimate truth about phenomena. And that's where we last time looked at the first two systems. And let me say that these four tenet systems, they should really be understood as a gradual path of, you could say, deeper insight. So the Vibhashikas, they look at phenomena and they understand that they are essentially made up of atoms. They're made up of what they call indestructible particles, which is what atom means. And they also understand that there's a mind that is continuous, that we always have a mind, subtle moments of mind. And not continuous, actually, but that we understand that there are moments of consciousness that continually take place. And our delusion, if you like, lies in actually attributing a continuity to that. Similarly, also, with regards to the world outside, everything is made out of atoms, of particles, and so on. And our delusion lies in attributing a solid reality to them as they appear. So that's where it's a little bit like what we learned in physics, where we know that things, of course, as they are, as they appear, but then if we break them down, we come down to the atomic level, to the particle level. That's where the Vibhashikas, they're a little bit more, you could say, sophisticated, because they are part of a science that looks at the role of the mind. And that's also where then this understanding of, oh, I am in this particular way, and everything that I experience in the mind is actually there. They also then analyze that. And that's then where they see that there is, in fact, just moments of mind that take place all the time. So that's the Vibhashikas. The Sautrantikas, they are more interested in how it is that we attribute solidity to things, and they understand that, in fact, we don't actually touch on phenomena, but we really just operate from a place of projection. And that's where they talk about then how we project onto phenomena, and how the ultimate truth of phenomena is what lies beyond our projections. Now, I'm just going to again draw on a text that I used last time, something that I wrote just to give a little overview. And I'm just going to start up here, basically summing up something that the Vibhashika and Sautrantika systems have in common. And that is that both the Vibhashika and Sautrantika, they see things as existing externally and possessing a material composition or substance, asserting some reality in terms of both the object and consciousness. So they are what we call substantialists. They attribute some things extramental, something out there. Now, this is from the Mahayana perspective, we call this the Hinayana views, because they still have, you could say, a degree of you could say there's still some science there that is somewhat that is challenged from the point of view of the Mahayana. They say, well, one can go further than that. We can do better than that. But nevertheless, and last time there was some questions about, what if I am a Sautrantika or Vibhashika? And in fact, we all are, because we all at some level attribute solidity to things. And we all, to some level, we are aware of this fact that we project. So, I mean, the issues that the Vibhashika and Sautrantika deal with has a lot to do with the way that we perceive the world. So it's not like we're above that we belong to another school. We aspire to have deeper insight, but we need to begin somewhere. And as such, the Vibhashika and Sautrantika, they're really like, you could say, steps on the way. First we analyze things, and then we see, yes, they are made up of particles. Yes, my mind is made up of moments of experiencing a present moment, and so on. So that's where all of this applies to us, but we can go deeper. And so that's where then the next tenet systems, the Yogacarya and the Madhyamika, and these are then what we call the Mahayana, they go beyond the materiality of the previous ones. So Mahayana, we of course generally understand as the vehicle of the Bodhisattvas, and very often you could say, for practitioners who already, you could say, have a view, then the main emphasis is actually at that point the application of compassion and generating compassion, because compassion is that where we again go beyond that focusing on a self that needs the reassurance that there is an object and a subject. The Mahayana in generating compassion is what melts away this, you could say, concern about finding a safe place. So it's much greater. So that's where in the Mahayana we say the wisdom and compassion work together. So we have this view, what we call the view of emptiness, and the view of compassion that work together. But we particularly, if you ask most Mahayana practitioners, what is Mahayana about? They would say, oh, it's about, serving all sentient beings and ultimately bringing them to enlightenment. But this is informed by, you could say, an insight into the nature of reality. So that's where what we're looking at here has a lot to do with that. Now, there's two Mahayana traditions then, Yogacarya and Madhyamika. And they have everything to do with what we experience. We probably know that we have this experience of self and other. And let me just go back to the root text again, where it says, the subject and object appearing as two separate things, perceiver and perceived, is the all-concealing truth, meaning relative truth. By contrast, non-dual mind that which is free from that construct or idea or labeling of self and other. That is the ultimate. This is the tenet or the view of the Chittamatra school. So this is important. So just before we go to Kangyur Rinpoche's commentary, which really you could say takes it a little bit for granted that you're already grounded in knowledge about this, I'll just present this as I have found it helpful to explain it. And that's where then here the Yogacharya identifies how all phenomena we perceive are in fact personal experience, and that dividing personal experience into outer objects and inner subjects is delusion. If we analyze, we can see the way that we construct the outer world is entirely the way that we do it. Now, it's important that this doesn't fall into what in Western philosophy is called solipsism, that we just think, oh, there's nothing else in the reality beside me. I can't be sure that there's nobody else out there except me. So that's sort of a common idea. Of course, you could say the refutation of that is, well, if that was the case, there'd be no point with there being solipsism as a philosophy, since you're the only one. You know, who is there else to communicate this with? So that's where the solipsist view in Western philosophy doesn't go very far, but nevertheless, it is seen as basically a flaw or a place where we can go wrong. We think, oh, there's only me here. But what we're doing with the understanding that we see that we're projecting self and other is actually understanding that the assumption that there's a reality out there and the way that we that's external to us, in fact, is profoundly flawed, because if we analyze, we can more and more see how it is really us who are projecting and constructing the world out there. At a very deep level, we could say even everything that we refer to in terms of qualities, or what we call qualia, phenomena that are perceived as solid. Actually, if we go in and analyze it, we can see even the way that we construct color or construct the perceptions that we have has everything to do, actually doesn't have a base, but it's rather, it exists on the way that we solidify it and construct it. Now, we essentially come down to then understanding that the mind is what creates this you could say experience that we have, and that's where we then say the mind can go into two places, and that's the whole Buddhist project, is that it can go into confusion, what we call samsara, and it can be free of confusion, which we call nirvana, and that's all takes place within the mind. So the Yogacharyas, they talk about three nature. Like Kangyur Rinpoche says, they see mind in terms of three natures. The deluded perceptions, Kangyur Rinpoche says, the deluded perceptions we have of the world is constructed by our delusional mind. The experience of the imaginary nature, which is essentially samsara. The absence of such ignorance is the perfected nature, and this corresponds to nirvana. Our mind that can, sorry, this is not Kangyur Rinpoche, gosh, this is embarrassing. This is yours truly. Sorry, but this will take us to Kangyur Rinpoche's state. The absence of such ignorance is the perfected nature, and this corresponds to nirvana. Our mind that can project either samsara or be freed into nirvana is the dependent nature. The imaginary nature is relative truth, and the perfected nature is ultimate truth. So let's just, for your reassurance that that you're getting Kangyur Rinpoche's view on this, let's go to the Kangyur Rinpoche's commentary here. He says, the Chittamatrans say that through the power of habit, we assign a distinct existence both to the perceiving mind and to its perceived object. Whereas in reality, the two do not exist as separate entities. The object apprehending mind, the subject, and the percepts of the mind, meaning the object, which are falsely reified as truly and separately existing entities, are referred to here as imputed reality. That means that this mind that thinks in terms of subject and object and thinks that there's a solid I here, there's a solid other out there, that is the condition that we call the imputed reality. It's our experience. Ladies and gentlemen, this is what we are experiencing right now. You know, when we in the tradition, you know, we rather, you could say, in the Buddhist teaching, we talk about no self, right? We talk about, you know, how things are. But we need to also understand that first, where are we in this? I was just reading some papers about how there's, you know, no self, minimal self. But before we even go there, we actually first need to understand that on the backdrop of a huge self, a big, enormous self that we call ego. And that's what we need to cure. When we're doing philosophy here, if we're doing analysis, it's certainly with the intention to apply that as an antidote to a very humble recognition that we have ego, we have an illness, we have an assumption about something. And that's where this is what we call the imputed reality. And that's what we experience. So we need to identify what is the illness. You know, one thing is that you can imagine what it's like to, you can say, be free of the illness. And that is our basic nature, homeostasis, or our abiding, you could say, reality. But we also need to appreciate that there's a condition of confusion that needs to work on, we need to work on. And that's where then the imputed reality refers to this condition. In various translations, we also say the imaginary nature. And everything other than that is absolute. That means that you could say reality, things as they are naturally perfect. The world out there is naturally perfect. The only thing that's you could say getting in the way is our projection, our confusion. So Kangyur Rinpoche says, the absolute truth refers, in the first place, to the ultimate essence of the dependent reality, meaning the actual nature of dependent reality means simply our mind. Namely the underlying substratum of mental appearances or percepts. So that's where we have a ground that you could say is our mind. And that is, you could say, the absolute nature itself, but it's covered over. Let me just bring up a little image that I drew some years ago. And I showed this to Tsongsa Kangyur Rinpoche, and he said, yeah, that's a very good way of explaining it. And it essentially works with understanding these three natures in terms of, you could just say this whole box here, that's divided up into a colored section and a section that's just white. Yeah, this whole box here. That's what we could call the mind. Now, what happens is then over here on the left side is that this mind is veiled. It's veiled by the confusion, obscuration. So that's the condition of samsara. That's where I am for the most part. Now, as I practice the path, when I calm the mind, when I practice virtue, when I practice the paramitas and so on, then gradually the obscurations become less and less. And what this reveals is an underlying aspect of the mind, and or rather we could say an underlying, the underlying mind as it is. And that's then the what we can call the pure dependent nature. What we have over here is the veiled dependent nature, the impure dependent nature when it's obscured. But the nature itself abides as perfect. And that's what the Yogacarya, they want to say. There's a perfect ground, which is during the time of being imputed or imaginary, caught up in confusion, then it's veiled. And then gradually through the practice of the path, then this, you could say, the abiding truth of the dependent nature is then becomes manifest. And that is then what is referred to as the perfectly existent nature. So in some way, this is a very good way to understand the path. And the Yogacharya, what really they did was very much, they were in dialogue. They were in dialogue with the world around them. They came after the Madhyamikas, but they were the ones who really, you could say, were in conversation with the world around them. And that's where talking about the mind and its, you could say, role in creating our reality, we need to understand that it's the mind that on one hand has the potential for confusion, and on the other hand, in and of itself, is not defined by the confusion. It is, you could say, in and of itself, perfect. So that's the premise of the Yogacharya, really, is that we have this Buddha nature that only is temporarily veiled. So this is where then you could say that's the Yogacharya position. Now, there's of course some squabbling. Sometimes people would say, but this mind itself also doesn't have any ultimate reality. And that's where, for the most part, the Yogacharya would say that's true. And they would, for the most part, agree with that. But there was one Yogacharya philosopher called Dhammapala, and undoubtedly there would have been others like him who would say, no, this mind is absolute. It is absolutely, truly existing. And that's again where we would then talk about that as falling into an ontological extreme or holding on to something. So that from the Madhyamika point of view, that's a problem. But that said, for the most part, the Yogacharya, they agreed with the Madhyamika. Now, when you read the Tibetans, the Tibetan presentation of the tenet systems, then they will very often sort of classify. You have the Vibhashika, then you have the Sutrantika, then you have the Yogacharya, and the highest is the Madhyamika. And of course, that works beautifully, but also the Yogacharya actually also has a very important role in terms of understanding and mapping both the conditions of samsara and the qualities of nirvana. That's where Tongse Rinpoche, he once said the Madhyamikas, they're really just the hippies, because they just come along and say, well, they just come along and critique everything. Or Nagarjuna comes along and essentially says there's nothing that is more than simply just a display of dependent arising and hence empty. And that's, of course, the last word. But nevertheless, it's quite helpful to appreciate how the Yogacharya explain things. We'll see here, the translator here of the text has something to say about that too. So this substratum itself, meaning the mind, is the self-knowing mind, void of duality of subject and object. So that's here where you could say the perfected mind. In the second place, the absolute truth also includes the actual reality, namely the fact that the dependent reality is empty of imputed reality. So that's where there's we can understand dependent of the ultimate nature as the purity of the dependent nature, and also as the perfectly existent nature. So that's where there's two ways of approaching this. But just in terms of understanding the role of the Yogacharya, I thought our dear friend, the translator, had, let's just see here. Actually, let's just see. Okay. I thought there was something more, but maybe not. So the absolute is the mind itself, the stuff of which objects wrongly imagined to be external entities are composed. So that's where we do experience a reality that we then consider as being external objects. So that's the mind that seems to be like that. Now, it is absolute because according to the Chittamatrans, the mind is an ultimate and irreducibly existent reality. Now, that said, this is how the way that it's classified, that they actually say that's how the Chittamatrans see things. But again, it should be said, not all Chittamatrans are actually guilty of that. The absolute truth consists too, not only in the mind itself, but in the fact that there is nothing but the mind, and that any phenomena only seems to be apart from it. So that's where then this asserts how the Chittamatrans, they understand the absolute as being the mind, where only there appears to be something external, but in fact there isn't. So here it says of the two aspects of the absolute truth, the first is called the absolute truth as a property possessor. And that is then when we have the absolute truth understood in terms of simply the pure nature of the dependent nature. And the second is the absolute truth as ultimate reality in itself. So let me just say one more thing about the Yogacharyans, and that is something that Mipam Rinpoche points out, and I really just know this from following almost religiously some of the classes of Woolston Fletcher, that we actually have two traditions of Yogacharya. One is what is called the what is it again, the Kai Semtsam, which is the scriptural, the Yogacharyas that follow the scripture. And then there's Drupte Semtsam, which are the Yogacharya that follow the tenet systems, or according to the tenet systems. And that actually is interesting because the first one, the Yogacharya that according to the scriptures, refer to the Buddha's teachings on what we call the third turning of the wheel, and it is associated with the Yogacharya. And that's where we have teachings like the Samdhya Niyamochana, the Lankavatara Sutra, where the Buddha talks about the primary role that the mind has, but he doesn't at any point say that it is absolute. So that's where there's no disagreement there with the second turning of the wheel. There's no disagreement with the Madhyamikas. But then you do have then what's called the Drumte Semtsam, or the Chittamatra Yogacharya according to the tenet systems. And that's where you do have some, in the tenet systems, some philosophers that attribute solidity or ultimate nature to this mind, the so-called substratum that we've been talking about here. And that is how it's ended up being presented in the tenet systems in the Tibetan system. So that's where sometimes there's some traditions that would sort of a little bit poo-poo the Yogacharya, but actually we're very grateful to them because they're actually the ones that really map the experience of samsara, the experience of the qualities of nirvana, and also the nature of the path that goes from confusion to awakening. So that's where the Yogacharya have done great service. We have great works like the works like the Mahayana Sutra Lamkara by I think Asanga or Vasubandhu, and other works that really talk about the sort of the qualities of the nature of samsara, nirvana, and the path. So they're very, very helpful. So that's where we could say, just remember that the Yogacharyas are the one that identify really how it is mind that creates everything. Then we get to the Madhyamikans. They'll tell us, yes, but even this mind has no reality. Nothing has any reality. It really just exists on the basis of causes and conditions. And that's, of course, Very valuable. So, two-minute break, or 2-second break, maybe 10-second break. And also, if anybody has questions, go ahead. Let's see here. There's somebody who put something here. Could you please explain again why it is called dependent nature? Yes, because that nature has, you could say, it doesn't have the autonomy, or rather it doesn't abide in just one condition. It can be, and look at ourselves. You can say where we can identify the dependency is in our own mind. We can see that this mind, dependent on whether I'm sort of having, for example, thoughts of gratitude, then the mind opens up. I sit there with love, gratitude, then it opens up. Then I'm thinking in terms of resentment, anger, aggression, and the mind closes down. So that's where we can say this mind is a very, it depends. It's dependent on the conditions that are put onto it. And particularly, we talk about it in terms of then it being veiled by the causes and conditions that create confusion. Kleshas and karma. Yeah. But then dependent on the elements that purify this, the practice of the path, then also it opens up. See if there's any other questions. No? All right.
Can I just ask,
Yeah,
could you show the your own this picture again where?
Sure.
Yeah.
Let me just find it here.
Mm-hmm.
Voila.
Right. So if I look at the very right, the perfectly existent nature. So this is also a dependent nature. This is actually where the question came from. If I look to the very right, where it seems like it's very clear and no kleshas and obscurations.
Yeah.
It's all, but that is still dependent, is it?
Yes, and that's where we use the word the pure dependent nature. Mm-hmm. And I've tried to, and this is also where you could say the underlying qualities of this nature become manifest. That's why I gave it some coloring there, nice blue and red, and to sort of indicate that it's not just this sort of, you could say, half-life that samsara is, but it's really there that all the qualities that are innate to us, like, for example, when we study Buddha nature, you know, Tsongtse Rinpoche, for some years, he talked a lot about a text called the Uttara Tantra. And there it talks a lot about all the qualities of awakening. And also when we look at our teachers, for example, we see people with great qualities. And they would say, oh, but their mind is no different from ours. It's only that there's a little bit of a temporary condition that we call samsara, which is then gradually being eliminated through the path. But we see in the Dalai Lama, we see in the Kangyur Rinpoches, we see in His Holiness Sakya Trinzen and all the great masters, you know, men and women down since the Buddha. They actually, they are, you could say, they have all these qualities on the basis of, you could say, the pure nature being, or the dependent nature being uncovered for what it truly is. Mm-hmm. So that's where, yeah.
No, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's more on the what we can call the property possessor in the text, where you could say the place that possesses these qualities is this pure dependent nature. But in and of itself, that nature of awakening itself is really free from any kind of reference point to anything. It's when delusion falls apart, and then there's no notion of, you know, a mind or a not mind. There's simply delusion that falls away. So that's why it sits on the far extremity there. And when you come down to the, you know, when we come down to the very bottom, the implication is then there's no more of this, you could say, the white section. It's simply just, it's like when we've been sick, and then when we're no longer sick, you know, we don't say, oh, how are you? And then you say, I have no longer the flu. We don't say that. We just say, I'm well. Mm-hmm. There's no more any notion of a flu. or whatever it was we had.
Nirvana are both dependent?
No, that's the thing, it's not. That's where we'd want to make it clear that when there's the elimination of the obscurations, then we come down to the nature as it is, you could say, in and of itself. There's no longer the condition of that obscures. Just like I say, when we become well, then we're simply just well. We're not defined by any illness. We're simply just well.
Jakob,
Yeah.
hello.
Hello.
My question is, if there is finally the perfectly existent nature, that's Buddha nature, and Buddha nature then would be Dharmakaya directly.
Yes.
As there is no difference between Buddha nature and Dharmakaya.
Yeah. Dharmakaya really just means the us awakening to what is, that there's no longer any delusion.
Yeah, okay.
And then once we talk about the Dharmakaya, then of course we begin to talk about the qualities of the Dharmakaya. And that's where we talk about the qualities of Buddha nature, right? And that's where we would say Buddha nature serves sentient beings. There's a natural Rupakaya, there's a natural manifestation of enlightenment, because it's not centered on itself. It doesn't retreat into some, nirvana where we're just, all absorbed in ourselves. It's actually where everything is set free. Just like we in our ordinary life, when we're well, we have so much to give. And similarly, also when an individual is free and awakened, they have so much to give. They're not holding back. So that's where then the Dharmakaya manifests compassionately as the Sambhogakaya and Yamanakaya, and the ways that we classify then the display of awakening or awakened compassion.
Hi, Jacob. There are two Tibetan script there, the Tibetan language on this picture. What are they mean?
Sorry, this is because I was using it in another class, but it refers to two styles of the two truths that occur when we are talking about the third turning of the wheel. You see, the second turning of the wheel, we generally talk about the two truths as being how things appear and how they are. Relative truth, absolute truth. And that's sort of in the object. That's simply just how things are, They're objectively empty, and they relatively appear on the basis of causes and conditions. Now, in the third turning of the wheel, which is about the subject, you could say the experiencer, then we talk about when the experiencer experiences a conflict between how things appear and how they are. And that's where we talk about the relative truth as being the confused condition, and absolute truth as being when there no longer is a conflict between how things are and how they appear. And that's where we refer to that as the ultimate truth. So it's really just one is, you can say, the inauthentic experience of a sentient being, and the other is the authentic experience of an awakened being. Nenang mitumpe demba and nenang tumpe demba. But that's a little bit extrinsic to our present discussion. Sorry, it was just because I just had this using it in another context. All right. Shall we proceed to the Madhyamaka? And again, the reason why we have these four tenet systems is really to appreciate all the many different teachings that we have, that the Buddha gave for particular individuals. And also, all of them actually come with insight. So there's none of them that are particularly wrong. They sort of having increasing bigger and bigger scope. And that's why the Tibetans, they sort of appreciated how there were so many different teachings in India. And so they became really the custodians of, you could say, the various ways that the teaching could be presented. And this is very helpful for us in the modern world, because we also come from a place where there's so many different competing discourses of truth, that it's good for us to actually have something that begins with, for example, the atomic, the atom theory, the atomists, and then gradually work their way through. If we were just right away thrown into the deep end and said, hey, here's the Madhyamaka, and it tells you that nothing has any inherent existence, then that's a big one. So there's a very compassionate quality about this, gradually easing us into an understanding. Now, this will actually be reflected in what we now have, which is the two kinds of Madhyamaka, because there's the Svatantrika Madhyamaka that's very big on understanding relative truth, and then the Prasangika Madhyamaka, which is very big on simply letting go of any reference point. And some years ago, Tsongtse Khyentse Rinpoche taught the Prasangika Madhyamaka view of Chandrakirti. And that is, of course, the ultimate view of the you could say, all the Tibetan schools of all the Tibetan traditions. Everybody agrees that the Prasangika Madhyamaka is the highest. But actually, particularly in the Nyingma tradition, there's actually a lot of emphasis of also understanding the relative truth. And that's where the Svatantrika Madhyamaka, they agree with the Prasangika, but they also understand the value of explaining and understanding relative truth. So they actually have they're quite helpful in that regard. I'll just very briefly go over you could say, my own little summary of the Madhyamaka here, where it says, Madhyamaka means the middle way, where there is freedom from the extremes of conceptual ideas about reality. And that's also when we say the middle way, it's not like you have the right way, the wrong way, and here then the correct way, whatever, the left or the right or so on. It's actually the absence of any kind of conceptual idea. So the Madhyamikas show that any attempt to objectify or construct ideas about ultimate reality fails. And that's where there's something very beautiful about that, because it really tells us we want to be free from dogma. We can never really understand reality as long as we are approaching it through some particular optics. And that's where, of course, we can say, oh, but Madhyamaka is also optics. And that's where, yes, but then we distinguish between what we call the Madhyamaka of words and the ultimate Madhyamaka, because Madhyamaka is really just intending to, you could say, be a critique of our beliefs. And what is so beautiful about it is it doesn't come up with its own belief. It simply just identifies how we hold on to things. But it doesn't then say, oh, and here is the truth. That would just make it into a new dogma. So in some way, you could say the Madhyamaka is very much sort of in the spirit, the postmodern spirit of not being held back by, you could say, concepts, reference points, bias, tradition, if you like, and so on. So that's where here, for the Madhyamikas, our ordinary perceptions are relative truth, while the ultimate truth is the absence of any conceptual reference points. So it's not about saying there's nothing there, but it's simply just allowing ourselves to remain completely open in our experience. This insight of freedom from conceptual constructions is regarded as the highest of all views. So that's where you very often come across this term, freedom from conceptual elaboration or freedom from conceptual constructs. In Sanskrit, it's nish prapancha, in Tibetan, trödrel. And this is a term that is basic to, you know, if you're practicing Ngondro, or particularly if you're practicing sadhana, it continually comes up as, you could say, the integrate, showing the nature of what we call emptiness. So this is what you could say, this is the beauty of Madhyamika, but also Madhyamika is particular in that it is aiming at providing the experience of openness, of complete openness, and it does that by, you could say, critiquing all our reference points. Now that's general about the Madhyamikas. And I'll just then read Jigme Lingpa's then the text here. He says, all appearing things exist upon the level of the relative and are illusion-like by nature, though ultimately none is real, but is like space. To make affirmations is the way of the Svatantrika Madhyamika. So there's the understanding how everything is like, you could say, without anything that we can objectify or solidify. But at the same time, the Madhyamika, so the Svatantrikas, they actually go in and explain a little bit about what it is that we experience. And that's quite helpful for us in the modern context. Because, you know, if you're sort of in dialogue with anyone, or you sort of are exposed to the ideas that we have everywhere, well, you can be sure that everywhere there is a general, there's sort of propositions about how things are. So that's why it's quite helpful, actually, the Madhyamika approach of giving some understanding of how things appear. This is a really big topic, but anyway, Kangyur Rinpoche here then says, the Svatantrika Madhyamikas say that phenomena, form, and the other objects of the six senses, everything that we perceive, have a natural existence of their own on the relative level. So they're willing to talk about what we experience. And this is established by conventional reasoning. So we can understand cause and effect, and simply, you know, everything that we do, for example, in science to navigate and understand our reality. And the way that we operate in the world is all based on knowing how to, you say, handle the world. So there's a relative experience that is accommodated here. Although phenomena have no true existence, yet on their own level, so to speak, they do exist, right? We all here in this Zoom room, we all exist, right? In this context, existing from their own side, existing on their own level, existing according to their characteristics, and substantially existing are regarded as synonymous. And this is simply just what we in plain language say, hey, we're real, you know, we're real. Now, what the Prasangikas, they would do is saying, yeah, it appears that it's real, but there's nothing there. End of story. The Svatantrikas, however, they're willing to do philosophy. And they would say, yes, there is a perception, but it takes place on the basis of, then you can say, the world out there. And that's what we call the Sotrantika Svatantrikas. But there's then we might say, there's a reality out there, it's created by mind. And that's what we then call the Yogacharya Svatantrikas. So hold on, don't mind, there's a little subtlety here. But anyway, don't worry about that. It's just basically that there's some explanation happening. And what these expressions refer to is not considered the proper object of refutation by reasoning that establishes the absolute truth. And that simply means that for the Svatantrikas, they are okay with that. They just say, okay, this is what we experience in relative truth, and we're not particularly right now going to make a big deal about how it's not there. The Prasangikas, they'll do that job. But the Svatantrikas, they're willing to actually explain a little bit. And that's where it says, thus, for the Svatantrikas, it seems that when the Madhyamika texts say that phenomena are without inherent existence, it is necessary to add that this is to be understood on the level of the absolute truth alone. So that's where the Svatantrikas, they are Madhyamikas, and they would say, oh yes, on the ultimate level, nothing has any reality. But they are very willing to talk about what's going on the relative level. Those of you who have had the chance to follow Woolston Fletcher's teaching on the adornment of the middle way will have been exposed to the, you could say, the intricacies of the Svatantrikas. And in the Nyingma tradition, there's a lot of respect for the Svatantrikas, particularly over the last 100 years, where Jamgon Mipa Rinpoche did an enormous favor, really inspired by, or rather at the command of his teacher, Jamyang Khyentse Wangpo, who said, you know, the Nyingma teachings on sutra has waned, so that nowadays these teachings, they're no longer, they're just like a lamp painted on a wall. So it looks like a lamp, but it's not. It doesn't give out light. And basically what Khyentse Wangpo was saying to Mipa Rinpoche is, you know, we're in the beauty of the Nyingma teachings on these things has been lost. You need to do something about it. So that's where Mipa Rinpoche wrote a beautiful commentary, essentially celebrating the wisdom of the Svatantrika Madhyamika. And for us in the modern world also, I think it's very helpful that we have a understanding of emptiness, yet also have a way of understanding the relative truth. And that's where the Svatantrika Madhyamika are very, very helpful. Now, like I said, there's a lot to be said about this, but we should probably stop here. What I'll do next time is I'll just start here. And we actually have a very helpful little footnote from the translator. This also will sort of a little bit sort of reiterate what I've just been saying in terms of the value of explaining relative truth. Okay. I'll just here see there's some questions. Let's do that. We might go a little bit over time. I hope that's all right. If so-called external reality is of the same substance of the mind, then the 5 elements are just the mind. Yes. The thing is, if we analyze any element, earth, fire, whatever, we break it down. And we would do this, for example, in physics, one does that, right? When we just say fire is gases, or what appears as solid out there are the atoms, and so on. And so then we break it down into to increasingly subtle degrees. But what the point of the acharyas is that they would say even the more we break it down, we never find anything that can't be broken down further. There's never such a thing as an indestructible building block of phenomena. Everything is always, you could say, everything exists in relation on the basis of being constructed by a relationship. Everything is made up of relations. Essentially, the Madhyamikas would always say, you know, when this exists on the basis of that. And we can verify everything that we look at exists on the basis of standing in relationship that are put together. We don't find anything that stands on its own. So that's where we, on the other hand, we attribute solidity to things. And that's the mind that does that. Nature itself doesn't have that. You know how we have this provocative statement, in nature there are no straight lines. This you sometimes hear, you know. And that's, oh, but I thought there were straight lines from A to B. Isn't that a straight line? Yes, only in mathematics. But in reality itself, there are no straight lines in nature. And similarly, also in nature, there is no ultimate thing or particle there. It's the mind that creates the solidity that we perceive. And that's what we mean with then the elements of the mind. Then, okay. So someone says, very interesting, although quite complicated. Yes, it is complicated, but it's the kind of issue that we need, you know, we're talking about the path to enlightenment, and we're not talking about just sort of like having a good old time, having a, you know, I mean, if that's what, you know, we want, the Buddhism is fine with that. We can just practice meditation and that's fine. We'll be, you know, just happy, calm, like nice, friendly people. But at the same time, the Buddha says, as long as fundamental ignorance hasn't, you could say, been penetrated, we keep generating confused conditions. And that's what we call then the life worlds of samsara. And that's what we're looking at here. So that's where this is something that requires us actually applying the highest degree of discerning, the highest degree of analysis. And that's what, you know, I mean, right now you're having yours truly a nice, friendly Danish guy, you know, sitting here chatting about something, and it seems, you know, very sort of nice. But you might think, oh, but there's a higher science out there. And I have to say, sorry, what I'm referring to here is actually the highest science that has ever appeared, really. And from the time of the Buddha down till today, individuals have confirmed the validity of this science. So that's where we are going into, we are touching on a tradition of knowledge that goes far, you could say, much further than the tradition of knowledge that we are used to, which of course are excellent in terms of creating all sorts of wonderful technologies in medicine, technology, IT, and so on. Here it's a knowledge tradition of reality's actual nature. So we're going very far here. You know, I'm just humbly sitting here being the messenger, but I'm referring to a tradition that has, you could say, that the highest insight that we could possibly have about reality. So
Jakob, oh, sorry.
Yeah, so it's worth pursuing. Yes, go ahead.
Have you ever talked to any person being an Aborigine in Australia on your teachings or on Buddha?
You know, there's so many traditions in the world, and they all have a lot of insight. And they, you know, the Aboriginal tradition and the shamans of the US and so on, everywhere across the planet, they all have insights into the primary role of the subject, the mind. It's actually only our modern Western science that thinks of knowledge as really just being about objects.
No, but I mean, especially Aborigines.
Yeah.
I mean, a known concept on mind.
Yeah. No, you know, that's you could say not just Aboriginals, but you could say people everywhere in the world have such profound insights. So that's where, you know, we in the modern world have so much to learn from all the different traditions.
Sure. Thank you.
Sure. We need so much respect for, you know, and unfortunately, you know, the way that our educational system is set up is like, oh yeah, the modern materialist science is the highest science that could ever be. Then it says, a recent example of someone in the public sphere who appears to have gone beyond concepts like percentage. Oh, this is amusing. Thank you, Matt. Okay, Trump has said virtually 100% of the net job creation in the last year has gone to migrants. In fact, I've heard substantially more, and actually beyond that number, 100%. It's a much higher number than that, but the government has not caught up with that yet. Well, there's a fair bit of amusement. Sometimes one doesn't know whether to laugh or to cry, right? Okay, we've gone
higher than 100%.
Huh?
Well, he's
beyond
not
100%.
constrained. He's not constrained by concept.
Totally. Oh, that's marvelous. That's great. Thank you for that. Okay, people, we'll conclude with some dedication here. And let's see. Through all our births, wherever we may be born, may we be endowed with the 7 good qualities of the higher realms. As soon as we're born, may we meet with the Dharma and have the freedom to practice it properly. At that time, may we please the holy gurus and practice the Dharma throughout the day and night. Realizing the Dharma and accomplishing its essential meaning, may we cross the ocean of existence in that life. Thoroughly teaching the holy Dharma in this world, may we never tire of accomplishing the benefit of others. By this vast benefit of others without partiality or bias, may all attain Buddhahood together. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.